Picture this. It's a little girl's 8th birthday party, chocolate cake, pink candles, and a father who adores her. Within hours, that same father would be dead. Within days, that innocent child would be drugged, tortured, and locked away in a psychiatric prison, all because she witnessed something she was never supposed to see. This isn't fiction. This is the true story of Sophia Sterling, an 8-year-old who discovered her stepmother's deadly secret and paid the ultimate price for telling the truth. What you're about to hear will shock you, break your heart, and ultimately restore your faith in the power of human resilience. From a millionaire's mansion to the basement of a psychiatric hospital where children disappear forever. From corrupt judges to experimental brain surgery designed to erase memories. This is a story of how evil can hide behind a beautiful smile, and how sometimes the most broken people become the strongest warriors. But I'm warning you, once you start listening to Sophia's journey, you won't be able to stop. Because this isn't just about one girl's fight for survival. It's about a conspiracy so vast and cruel that it will change everything you think you know about the systems designed to protect children. The chocolate birthday cake sat perfectly centered on the marble kitchen island. 8 pink candles flickering in the late afternoon sunlight that streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling mansion. Sophia Martinez Sterling, her dark hair tied back with a ribbon that matched her new dress, took a deep breath and closed her eyes tight. "Make a wish, sweetheart," her father Richard Sterling said, his arm wrapped around her small shoulders. At 45, Richard was still handsome in the way that successful businessmen often are. Silver threading through his dark hair, laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of a man who genuinely enjoyed his life and the people in it. Victoria Sterling stood across the kitchen island, her manicured hands folded precisely as she watched the scene with what appeared to be maternal warmth. At 34, she was strikingly beautiful in an calculated way. Blonde hair that never seemed out of place, green eyes that could shift from loving to calculating in the space of a heartbeat, and a smile that had charmed Richard into marriage just 2 years earlier. "I wish," Sophia began, then stopped and giggled. "No, I can't tell you or it won't come true." "Smart girl," Richard laughed, ruffling her hair. "Just like your mother was." Victoria's smile flickered for just a moment at the mention of Richard's first wife, Maria Martinez, who had died in a car accident when Sophia was 4. The insurance settlement from that accident had been substantial, though Victoria had never mentioned knowing about it until after she and Richard were married. Sophia blew out all 8 candles in one breath, and the small gathering applauded. Besides her parents, there was Tommy Martinez, her 16-year-old half-brother, who was home from boarding school for the weekend, Mrs. Patterson from next door, and Dr. Samuel Ross, the family physician who had been treating Richard for what he claimed was stress-related heart palpitations. "What did the birthday girl wish for?" Dr. Ross asked, cutting himself a generous slice of cake. "She can't tell," Tommy said protectively. "That's the rule." Victoria's phone buzzed against the granite counter. She glanced at the screen, and Richard noticed her expression change slightly. "Everything okay, honey?" Richard asked. "Just work," Victoria replied smoothly, sliding the phone into her designer purse. "Marcus wants to discuss some pharmaceutical contracts." What Richard didn't see was the text message that had made Victoria's pulse quicken. Timeline moved up. Board meeting scheduled for Friday. Need confirmation of asset transfer by end of week. The party continued for another hour with Sophia opening presents and laughing at Tommy's increasingly ridiculous jokes. But Victoria found herself checking her phone repeatedly, and when she thought no one was looking, she stepped into the hallway to make a quiet call. "Marcus, it's me," she whispered into the phone. "Yes, I saw your message. Friday is too soon. Richard is still asking too many questions about his medication. I understand the board is impatient, but we can't rush this. One mistake and everything falls apart." She paused, listening to her brother's voice on the other end. "The girl is not a problem. She's 8 years old. By the time this is over, she'll be too traumatized to remember details. And even if she does, who's going to believe a grieving child over medical professionals? Yes, I've already spoken to Dr. Ross about the psychological evaluation protocols. Everything is in place." Shiro. Victoria ended the call and returned to the kitchen, where Richard was helping Sophia carefully wrap leftover cake for Tommy to take back to school. "Sorry about that," Victoria said, her voice bright with false cheer. "Work emergency." "On Sophia's birthday?" Richard frowned. Can't the pharmaceutical world survive one evening without you? Apparently not, Victoria laughed, but there was an edge to it that made Sophia look up from her cake wrapping. That night, after Tommy had returned to school and the neighbors had gone home, Sophia lay in her canopy bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. Through the heating vents, she could hear her parents talking in their bedroom down the hall. I'm worried about you, Richard, Victoria was saying. You've been so tired lately, and Dr. Ross said your blood pressure readings have been concerning. I feel fine, Richard replied. Better than I have in months, actually. But that's exactly what worries me. Sometimes people feel better right well, before their condition worsens significantly. Sophia frowned. Her father seemed perfectly healthy to her. He'd been playing tennis twice a week, working his usual long hours at Sterling Tech Solutions, and had even started talking about taking the family to Europe for Christmas. Maybe you should let me handle more of the business decisions, Victoria continued, just until you're feeling stronger. I've been learning so much about the tech industry, and with my pharmaceutical background, I could help bridge the gap between your companies. Victoria, I appreciate the concern, but I'm not an invalid. Sterling Tech is my life's work, and I want to help protect that work for Sophia's future. The conversation continued, but Sophia's 8-year-old attention span had reached its limit. She drifted off to sleep, unaware that down the hall, Victoria was already planning how to systematically destroy everything her father had built. The next morning brought the first subtle change. Victoria appeared at breakfast with a small pill organizer, neatly divided into daily compartments. Dr. Ross wants you to start taking these supplements, she told Richard, setting the organizer beside his coffee cup. Vitamins, omega-3 fatty acids, something for your heart. He said they'll help with the stress symptoms. Richard picked up one of the large capsules and examined it. This seems like a lot of pills for someone who feels fine. Prevention is better than treatment, Victoria said firmly. Besides, what's the harm in taking vitamins? Sophia watched her father reluctantly swallow the pills, washing them down with orange juice that Victoria had freshly squeezed. What none of them knew was that Victoria had spent months researching untraceable poisons that mimicked heart conditions, carefully calculating dosages that would cause gradual decline rather than sudden death. The changes in Richard were subtle at first. He complained of feeling tired after lunch, started forgetting small details about meetings, and began experiencing heart palpitations that sent him to Dr. Ross's office twice a week. Each time, Dr. Ross, who was receiving substantial payments from Victoria's pharmaceutical contacts, would adjust Richard's medication and recommend increased rest. I think you should consider stepping back from the day-to-day operations, Victoria suggested one evening, as Richard sat at his desk, struggling to focus on quarterly reports. Maybe bring in a management consultant, someone who can handle the stress while you recover. I don't need to recover from anything, Richard said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. The constant fatigue and confusion were wearing on him, making him doubt his own judgment. Of course not, Victoria soothed, but think about Sophia. If something happened to you, would you want her to inherit a struggling company or a thriving one? It was the perfect manipulation, appealing to Richard's love for his daughter while positioning Victoria as the solution to problems she was secretly creating. Within a month, Victoria had convinced Richard to sign papers giving her significant authority over Sterling Tech's financial decisions. What Richard didn't know was that Victoria had been systematically photographing his signatures, practicing his handwriting, and building relationships with key employees who could be bought or intimidated. By the time he realized what was happening, it would be too late to stop her. The final piece of Victoria's plan fell into place on a rainy October evening. Sophia had gone to bed early, complaining of a stomach ache that was actually the result of the mild sedatives Victoria had been adding to her dinner for the past week. Richard sat in his study, trying to review contracts that seemed to blur together no matter how hard he concentrated. Victoria entered with his evening pills and a cup of tea. Dr. Ross says these new heart medications might make you feel worse before you feel better, she said, watching carefully as Richard swallowed the capsules. But he's confident they'll help with the irregular rhythms. I don't remember having irregular rhythms, Richard said slowly. Memory issues are common with heart conditions, Victoria replied smoothly. That's why I've been keeping such careful track of your symptoms and medications. Richard drank the tea, not noticing the bitter aftertaste that Victoria had masked with honey and lemon. Within 20 minutes, he was struggling to stay awake. Within an hour, his heart would stop beating entirely. Victoria, he mumbled as consciousness slipped away. Something's wrong. Call an ambulance. Of course, darling, Victoria whispered. But she made no move toward the phone. Instead, she sat beside his chair and watched as the man who had trusted her with his life and his daughter's future died slowly and quietly in his own home. When she was certain he was gone, Victoria waited exactly 30 minutes before calling 911, giving herself time to dispose of the special teacup and replace it with an empty whiskey glass. By the time the paramedics arrived, she was the picture of a devastated wife who had found her husband collapsed in his study. He'd been so depressed lately, she sobbed to the EMTs, talking about feeling like a failure, worried about leaving Sophia alone. I should have seen the signs. Dr. Ross arrived within an hour and pronounced Richard dead of an apparent heart attack, likely brought on by stress and underlying cardiac issues. There would be no autopsy. Dr. Ross's word was trusted, and Victoria's grief appeared genuine. As the coroner's van pulled away from the Sterling mansion, Victoria stood in the doorway holding a sleeping Sophia, who had been given enough sedatives to keep her unconscious through the entire ordeal. "Don't worry, sweetheart," Victoria whispered to the unconscious child. "Mommy's going to take very good care of you." The smile that crossed Victoria's face in that moment would have chilled anyone who saw it. But there was no one left to see it except an 8-year-old girl who was about to learn that monsters were real, and sometimes they lived in your own house. The morning of Richard Sterling's funeral dawned gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into everything. Sophia stood in front of her bedroom mirror, while Victoria helped her into a black dress that had been purchased specifically for the occasion. "Remember what we discussed," Victoria said, her voice gentle but firm as she brushed Sophia's dark hair. "Daddy was very sick, and his heart couldn't handle the stress anymore. It's very sad, but sometimes these things happen." Sophia nodded, though something about Victoria's explanation felt wrong. Her father hadn't seemed sick to her. Tired, yes, but not sick enough to die. And why had Victoria thrown away all of his medications the day after he died, claiming they were too painful to keep around? "Can I keep Daddy's picture by my bed?" Sophia asked. "Of course, sweetheart. We'll always remember Daddy." Victoria's reflection in the mirror smiled, but her eyes remained cold. "Now, there will be lots of people at the funeral today. Some of them might ask you questions about Daddy. Just tell them he was sad and tired, okay?" The funeral service was held at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, the same church where Richard and Victoria had been married 2 years earlier. The sanctuary was packed with employees from Sterling Tech, business associates, neighbors, and friends who struggled to understand how a man who had seemed so vital could die so suddenly. Sophia sat in the front pew between Victoria and Tommy, who had been granted emergency leave from boarding school. Her half-brother's eyes were red from crying, and he kept reaching over to squeeze her hand during the service. "I should have been here," Tommy whispered to her during one of the hymns. "I should have known something was wrong." "Nobody knew," Sophia whispered back, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Behind them, Jake Thompson sat with several other business partners from Sterling Tech. Jake was a successful entrepreneur in his own right, having built a software company that frequently collaborated with Richard's firm. The two men had been close friends for over a decade, and Jake was struggling with guilt over their last conversation. 3 weeks earlier, Richard had called Jake late at night, his voice slurred with fatigue or alcohol. Jake hadn't been sure which. "Something's not right, Jake," Richard had said. "Victoria keeps pushing me to sign papers, make changes to the company structure. And I feel terrible all the time, like my brain is wrapped in cotton." "Maybe you should see a different doctor," Jake had suggested. "Get a second opinion." "Victoria says Dr. Ross is the best. She's probably right. She usually is about medical stuff." Jake had dismissed the call as stress-related paranoia, but now, watching Victoria's composed grief at the funeral, he found himself wondering if Richard's instincts had been correct. The graveside service was mercifully brief. As the small crowd dispersed, offering final condolences to Victoria and promises to keep in touch, Sophia noticed a man in an expensive suit watching from beside a black sedan. He was tall and lean, with the kind of military bearing that suggested careful discipline. When Victoria saw him, she gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Who's that man?" Sophia asked Tommy. "I don't know," Tommy replied, following her gaze, "but Victoria seems to know him." The man was Marcus Sterling, Victoria's older brother and the architect of the plan that had just claimed Richard's life. A former military contractor with connections in pharmaceutical research, Marcus had spent 2 years helping Victoria identify the perfect combination of drugs that would simulate heart disease while remaining undetectable in standard toxicology tests. That afternoon, the family gathered at the law offices of Patterson and Associates for the reading of Richard's will. The office was decorated in the kind of heavy wood and leather that was supposed to convey tradition and trustworthiness, but Sophia found it oppressive and cold. Attorney Patterson, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and nervous habits, cleared his throat repeatedly as he prepared to read the document. "The last will and testament of Richard Sterling is quite comprehensive," he began, his voice formal and detached. "Mr. Sterling was very specific about his wishes regarding both his personal assets and his business interests." Victoria sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap and her expression appropriately solemn. But Sophia noticed that her stepmother's fingers were tapping silently against her purse, a nervous habit Victoria usually controlled better. "To my beloved daughter, Sophia Martinez Sterling," Patterson read, "I leave controlling interest in Sterling Tech Solutions, currently valued at approximately $52 million, to be held in trust until her 21st birthday." Sophia's eyes widened. She had known her father was successful, but she hadn't realized the company was worth so much money. "The trustee and legal guardian of both the assets and the minor child," Patterson continued, "shall be Victoria Sterling, with full authority to make financial and personal decisions until Sophia reaches majority age. Additionally, I leave the family home and all personal property to my wife Victoria Sterling, along with a life insurance benefit of $2 million. Victoria dabbed her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the grieving widow perfectly. "Richard was so generous," she murmured. "I just want to make sure Sophia has everything she needs." What Patterson didn't read aloud, because it wasn't part of the official will, was a codicil that Richard had handwritten and hidden in his personal safe. In that document, Richard had expressed concerns about Victoria's behavior and requested that if anything happened to him, an independent investigation should be conducted into the circumstances of his death. That codicil had disappeared from the safe the night Richard died, along with several other documents that might have raised uncomfortable questions about Victoria's activities. After the will reading, Victoria drove Sophia and Tommy back to the Sterling mansion. The house felt different now, larger and colder, as if Richard's presence had been the only thing making it feel like home. "I think Tommy should stay for a few more days," Victoria announced as they entered the foyer, "just until we all adjust to this new situation." "I'd like that," Tommy said quickly. He'd been dreading the return to boarding school, partly because of grief, but mostly because something about Victoria's behavior was triggering alarm bells he couldn't quite identify. That evening, while Victoria was on a lengthy phone call in her study, Tommy and Sophia sat in the kitchen sharing leftover casseroles that neighbors had brought. "Do you think Daddy seemed sick before he died?" Sophia asked suddenly. Tommy considered the question carefully. "He seemed tired when I was home for your birthday, but not sick, you know? More like, I don't know, confused maybe?" "Victoria says he was depressed. Did he seem depressed to you?" Sophia shook her head. "He seemed worried, like he was trying to figure something out." From the study came the sound of Victoria's voice, though they couldn't make out the words. But her tone was sharp and businesslike, very different from the grief-stricken widow she'd been portraying all day. "I want to hear what she's saying," Tommy whispered. They crept closer to the study door, which Victoria had left slightly ajar. Her voice became clearer as they approached. "Marcus, we need to accelerate the timeline," Victoria was saying. "The boy is asking too many questions, and I don't like the way he's looking at me." There was a pause as she listened to whoever was on the other end. "No, we can't just send him back to school early. That would look suspicious. But we need to neutralize him before he starts connecting dots." Another pause. "The psychiatric evaluation for the girl is scheduled for next week. Dr. Ross has already prepared the preliminary report. Severe trauma, behavioral issues, potential danger to herself and others. Once she's committed, we'll have years to consolidate control. Sophia grabbed Tommy's arm, her fingernails digging into his skin. Victoria was talking about having her committed to a psychiatric facility. What about the business partner, Jake Thompson? Victoria's laugh was cold and calculating. Thompson has his own secrets. I've done extensive research on his background. One phone call to the SEC about some questionable trading patterns from his early days, and he'll disappear faster than Richard's medical records. Tommy's blood turned to ice. Victoria was talking about destroying anyone who might ask questions about Richard's death or Sophia's welfare. Fine, Victoria continued. Schedule the transfer for Friday. The Montana facility is perfect. Isolated, minimal oversight, and they specialize in difficult cases. Once she's there, she'll be completely under our control. The call ended, and Tommy quickly pulled Sophia away from the door and back to the kitchen. Both children were pale with shock and fear. She killed Daddy, Sophia whispered, tears streaming down her face, and she's going to send me away. No, Tommy said firmly, though his voice was shaking. I won't let that happen. We have to tell someone. Who? You heard her. She has plans for anyone who might help us. Tommy thought frantically. They needed an adult who would believe them, someone with enough power to stand up to Victoria and her connections. But who? Jake Thompson, he said suddenly. Dad trusted him. Maybe we can warn him before Victoria gets to him. How do we contact him without Victoria knowing? Tommy pulled out his cell phone. I still have Dad's business contacts in my phone. We'll call him tomorrow when Victoria goes to her appointment with the lawyers. As they sat in the kitchen making desperate plans, neither child noticed the small recording device that Victoria had hidden behind the coffee maker 3 days earlier. Every word of their conversation was being transmitted to her study, where she listened with the cold satisfaction of a chess player who had anticipated her opponent's every move. By the time Victoria went to bed that night, she had already made 3 phone calls. One to Dr. Ross, moving up Sophia's psychiatric evaluation. One to Marcus, authorizing immediate action against potential threats. And one to the Mount View Residential Treatment Center in Montana, confirming that they would have a new patient arriving within the week. Sophia lay in her bed that night, clutching her father's photograph and trying to understand how her world had collapsed so completely in just a few days. She was 8 years old, and she was beginning to realize that the adults she trusted were either dead or planning to destroy her. But she was also Richard Sterling's daughter, and she had inherited more than just his money. She had inherited his intelligence, his determination, and his refusal to surrender when the stakes were high. Tomorrow she would start fighting back. She just had to figure out how. Jake Thompson sat in his downtown office at 3 in the morning, staring at newspaper articles spread across his mahogany desk. The headlines told a story that made less sense the more he thought about it. Tech entrepreneur dies suddenly. Sterling tech founder succumbs to heart condition. Family man leaves behind wife and daughter. The official story was clean and tragic. A successful businessman who had been struggling with heart problems and depression, finally succumbing to the stress of modern life. But Jake couldn't shake the memory of Richard's phone call 3 weeks before his death, the slurred confusion in his voice, the paranoid concerns about Victoria. Jake had built his own tech empire through careful attention to details that others missed, and every detail about Richard's death felt wrong. The sudden onset of heart problems in a man who had been healthy 6 months earlier. The convenient timing that left Victoria in control of a $50 million company. The speed with which the funeral had been arranged and the will executed. Most troubling of all was the photograph that had appeared in the business section of the newspaper. Victoria Sterling standing beside Richard's grave, her face a mask of perfect grief while her eyes remained cold and calculating. Jake had seen that expression before, in boardrooms where multi-million-dollar deals were won and lost. It was the look of someone who had gotten exactly what they wanted. His phone rang, interrupting his brooding. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something made him answer. Mr. Thompson? The voice was young, male, nervous. This is Tommy Martinez. I'm Richard Sterling's son. Jake sat up straight. Tommy, I'm sorry for your loss. Your father was a good man. Mr. Thompson, I need to talk to you. In person. It's about my dad's death. And about Sophia. What about Sophia? Victoria is planning to have her committed to a psychiatric facility. She thinks Sophia is dangerous, that she's having delusions about Dad being murdered. Jake's blood chilled. Are they delusions? There was a long pause. No, sir. I don't think they are. They arranged to meet at a 24-hour diner outside the city, far from Victoria's surveillance network. Jake arrived first and chose a booth in the back corner where they could talk without being overheard. When Tommy walked in with Sophia beside him, Jake was shocked by what he saw. The vibrant 8-year-old from Richard's photos had been replaced by a hollow-eyed child who seemed to have aged years in the past week. Her dark hair hung limp around a face that was too pale, too thin, too watchful. She moved like someone who expected attack from any direction. "Thank you for coming," Tommy said as they slid into the booth across from Jake. "Tell me everything," Jake replied. For the next hour, Sophia and Tommy laid out their story with the precision of witnesses who knew they would only get one chance to be believed. The gradual changes in Richard's health, the mysterious pills Victoria had been giving him, the overheard phone conversations about accelerating timelines and neutralizing threats. "She has a brother named Marcus," Tommy explained. "He was at the funeral, but he stayed in the background. From what we overheard, he's been helping her plan this whole thing." And you're sure she's planning to have Sophia committed?" "The appointment is tomorrow morning," Sophia said quietly. "Dr. Ross is going to say I'm dangerous because I believe Victoria killed my daddy." Jake studied the 8-year-old girl across from him, looking for signs of the mental instability that would justify psychiatric commitment. What he saw instead was a child in shock and grief, but with clear, rational thinking and a memory for details that was remarkably precise. "I made your father a promise," Jake said finally. "Right after you were born, Sophia. He asked me to watch out for you if anything ever happened to him. I think he knew even then that he might need backup." "Will you help us?" Tommy asked. "Yes," Jake said without hesitation. "But we need to be smart about this. Victoria has money, connections, and legal custody. If we move too fast or make mistakes, she'll bury all the evidence and have Sophia locked up where we can't reach her." Jake outlined his plan. He would file for emergency guardianship based on concerns about Victoria's fitness as a parent. His lawyers would request an independent psychiatric evaluation for Sophia, conducted by doctors who weren't connected to Victoria's network. Meanwhile, they would gather evidence of Victoria's financial motives and any connections to Richard's death. "This is going to take time," Jake warned. "Maybe weeks. Can you hang on that long?" "We don't have weeks," Tommy said urgently. "The commitment hearing is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon." Jake's expression hardened. "Then we'll have to accelerate our own timeline." He made a series of phone calls while the children ate pancakes neither of them really wanted. Emergency motions to family court, requests for protective custody, appeals to judges who owed him favors from years of charitable donations and political support. By dawn, Jake had assembled a legal team that included 2 of the city's most respected family law attorneys and a child psychologist who specialized in trauma cases. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m., just 2 hours before Victoria's planned commitment proceeding. "Get some sleep," Jake told Tommy and Sophia as he drove them to a hotel room he'd rented under an assumed name. "I'll pick you up at 8:30. But none of them slept. Victoria had discovered their absence and was systematically activating every resource at her disposal to locate them and destroy Jake's intervention. At 7 a.m., Jake's phone rang. The voice on the other end was silk over steel. "Mr. Thompson, this is Victoria Sterling. I understand you've been interfering with my family's private medical decisions." "Mrs. Sterling, I'm simply concerned about Sophia's welfare." "Your concern is misplaced and potentially criminal. Kidnapping is a serious federal offense. I haven't kidnapped anyone. I've provided shelter for children who asked for help." Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. "Have you checked your email this morning, Jake? I think you'll find some interesting documents waiting for you." Jake's laptop chimed with an incoming message. The attached files made his stomach drop to his feet. SEC investigation documents from 10 years earlier, detailing suspicious trading patterns in his early investments. Trades that had netted him his first million, but skirted dangerously close to insider trading violations. The evidence was damning and comprehensive. Bank records, communication logs, testimony from former employees who had been carefully coached to remember events in ways that supported the fraud narrative. If these documents were released to federal investigators, Jake would face criminal charges that could result in 10 years in prison. Impressive research, Jake said, his voice steady despite the panic racing through his system. I'm very thorough when it comes to protecting my family, Victoria replied. Now, I'm going to make this very simple. You will return my stepdaughter immediately and withdraw any legal motions you filed. In exchange, these documents remain private and you keep your freedom. And if I refuse, then by tomorrow morning, you'll be under federal investigation for securities fraud. Your assets will be frozen, your business will be destroyed, and you'll spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary. The line went dead. Jake stared at his laptop screen, watching his past mistakes scroll by in devastating detail. He thought about Richard's trust, Sophia's desperate eyes, and the weight of promises made to dead friends. He also thought about 10 years in federal prison, his company destroyed, his reputation in ruins. At 9:15 a.m., Jake's lawyers received a one-line email. Withdraw all motions. Client no longer wishes to pursue guardianship. When the hotel room door opened at 9:30, it wasn't Jake who entered. It was two orderlies from the Psychiatric Evaluation Center, accompanied by a police officer who looked deeply uncomfortable with his assignment. Sophia Sterling? The larger orderly asked. We're here to escort you to your appointment. Tommy stepped protectively in front of his sister, but the police officer shook his head. Son, don't make this harder than it has to be. We have legal orders. As they loaded Sophia into the van, she pressed her face to the window and searched desperately for any sign of Jake Thompson. But his black sedan was nowhere to be seen. Like every other adult who had promised to help her, he had chosen his own safety over her life. The betrayal hit Sophia like a physical blow, but it also crystallized something hard and bright in her chest. If the adults wouldn't save her, she would have to save herself. She was 8 years old and she was about to learn that sometimes the only person you can trust is the one looking back at you in the mirror. The van pulled away from the hotel, carrying Sophia toward a psychiatric evaluation that had been carefully designed to destroy her credibility forever. But Victoria Sterling had made one crucial mistake in her calculations. She had assumed that breaking Sophia's hope would break her will to fight. She was about to discover how wrong she could be. The offices of Dr. Amanda Ross were designed to project calm authority, soft lighting, abstract art, degrees from prestigious universities covering one wall. But to 8-year-old Sophia, sitting in an oversized leather chair that made her feel even smaller than she was, the room felt like a trap carefully disguised as safety. Dr. Ross herself was a severe woman in her 50s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and the kind of cold professionalism that passed for expertise in certain circles. What Sophia didn't know was that Dr. Ross had lost her license to practice in 2 other states for falsifying psychiatric evaluations, and that Victoria Sterling was paying her $50,000 to produce a specific diagnosis. Now, Sophia, Dr. Ross said, her voice honey-sweet with false concern, your stepmother tells me you've been having some very upsetting thoughts since your father died. I haven't been having thoughts, Sophia replied carefully. I've been remembering things. Sometimes when we're very sad, our memories can play tricks on us. Grief can make us remember things that didn't really happen, or make us think ordinary things are more scary than they really are. Sophia studied the doctor's face, looking for any sign of genuine interest in the truth. She found none. My daddy wasn't sick before he died, Sophia said. Victoria gave him pills every day that made him tired and confused. Dr. Ross made a note on her clipboard. Victoria tells me you've been very angry with her since your father's death. Sometimes children blame their parents when bad things happen, even when it's not anyone's fault. She's not my parent. She killed my daddy. That's a very serious accusation, Sophia. Do you understand what it means to say someone killed another person? It means they made them dead on purpose. Dr. Ross made another note, her pen moving quickly across the paper. Sophia couldn't see what she was writing, but she suspected it wasn't a fair representation of their conversation. The evaluation continued for 2 hours, with Dr. Ross asking questions that seemed designed to elicit responses that could be twisted into evidence of mental instability. She showed Sophia inkblot cards and asked what she saw. She had Sophia draw pictures of her family and then interpreted normal childhood art as signs of violent ideation. Most insidiously, She repeatedly suggested alternative explanations for Sophia's memories, gradually trying to convince the child that her own experiences were unreliable. Sometimes when people are very sick, they have to take medicine that makes them sleepy, Dr. Ross explained. That doesn't mean anyone was trying to hurt them. It means people who love them were trying to help them feel better. But Victoria laughed when she thought he was asleep, Sophia insisted. I heard her on the phone saying it was working faster than expected. Children often misunderstand grown-up conversations, Dr. Ross replied smoothly. Adults talk about many things that might sound scary to little ears, even when they're perfectly innocent. By the end of the session, Sophia felt as if her own mind was being dissected and reassembled into something unrecognizable. Every memory she shared was explained away. Every emotion she expressed was pathologized. Every instinct she had about Victoria's guilt was reframed as evidence of her own mental illness. I'm going to recommend that Sophia receive intensive residential treatment, Dr. Ross told Victoria after the evaluation. Her delusional thinking is quite advanced for her age, and she shows signs of potential violence toward authority figures. Victoria dabbed her eyes with a tissue, playing her role perfectly. I just want what's best for her. If you think residential treatment is necessary, I do. The facility I have in mind specializes in childhood trauma and behavioral disorders. They have excellent success rates with cases like Sophia's. What Dr. Ross didn't mention was that Sunrise Valley Treatment Center in Montana was owned by a pharmaceutical company that paid her substantial consulting fees. What she also didn't mention was that treatment at Sunrise Valley often involved experimental drug protocols that weren't approved for use in children. The commitment hearing that afternoon was a formality. Judge Patricia Hayes, who had received substantial campaign contributions from pharmaceutical companies, barely looked at Sophia as she sealed her fate. Based on the psychiatric evaluation in the guardian's testimony, Judge Hayes intoned, I hereby order Sophia Sterling to be transferred to Sunrise Valley Treatment Center for residential psychiatric treatment, duration to be determined by medical necessity. Sophia sat between two court-appointed advocates who had met her 15 minutes before the hearing and who made no effort to challenge the proceedings. As the gavel fell, she felt something inside her break. Not her spirit, but her faith in the justice system that was supposed to protect children like her. Victoria leaned over and whispered in her ear, I told you no one would believe a crazy little girl. The transport to Montana happened the next morning. Sophia was sedated for the journey to prevent her from becoming agitated, according to Dr. Ross's orders, and woke up in a concrete cell that smelled of disinfectant and despair. Sunrise Valley Treatment Center looked like a cross between a hospital and a prison. The windows had bars disguised as decorative metalwork, the doors locked from the outside, and security cameras monitored every common area. The staff wore uniforms that looked medical, but moved with the authority of corrections officers. Welcome to your new home, Sophia, said Director Harrison, a thin man with dead eyes and hands that lingered too long when he shook hers. We're going to take very good care of you here. The routine was designed to break her spirit systematically. Wake up at 5:30 a.m. for medication that made her thoughts foggy and her movements sluggish. Group therapy sessions where other children were rewarded for reporting any negative comments about their families or their treatment. Educational classes that consisted mainly of copying Bible verses about obedience and gratitude. The other children ranged from genuinely troubled to simply inconvenient. Sophia learned quickly that some, like 12-year-old Marcus Williams, had been committed for the crime of witnessing domestic violence. Others, like 10-year-old Sarah Chen, were there because they had accused relatives of sexual abuse that the family preferred to deny rather than address. The trick is to play along, Marcus whispered to Sophia during their first group therapy session. Tell them what they want to hear, take your medication without fighting, and maybe they'll let you go home eventually. What if home is worse than here? Sophia whispered back. Marcus's smile was bitter beyond his years. Then you learn to survive here. But the worst part of Sunrise Valley wasn't the physical conditions or the systematic dehumanization. It was the special sessions with Dr. Richard Brennan, a psychiatrist who specialized in memory reconstruction therapy. 3 times a week, Sophia was strapped to a chair, while Dr. Brennan used a combination of drugs and psychological manipulation to convince her that her memories of Victoria were false. Tell me about the night your father died, Dr. Brennan would say, his voice hypnotically calm as the drugs made Sophia's thoughts swim. Victoria poisoned him, Sophia would mumble through the chemical haze. No, Sophia, your father was very depressed. He told Victoria he wanted to die because he was so sad. She tried to help him feel better, but he was too sick to get well. That's not what happened. Your grief is making you remember things wrong. Let's practice the correct memory. Your father was sad. Victoria tried to help. Your father chose to leave because he was too sick to stay. Victoria saved you from seeing how sick he really was. After 6 months of this treatment, Sophia began to doubt her own memories. The drugs made it difficult to think clearly, and the constant repetition of alternative narratives started to feel more real than her actual experiences. Maybe she had imagined the conversations she'd overheard. Maybe her father really had been sick. Maybe Victoria was trying to help her get better. It was during one of these sessions that she overheard Dr. Brennan on the phone in his office next door. The Sterling girl is responding well to the protocol, he was saying. Another few months and she'll believe whatever we tell her to believe. Yes, the Guardian is very pleased with our progress. She's authorized increased funding for the experimental treatments. The fog lifted from Sophia's mind like smoke clearing from a room. Victoria wasn't trying to cure her. She was paying to have her mind systematically destroyed. The realization hit her with crystalline clarity. If she was going to survive this place, she had to pretend the brainwashing was working while secretly maintaining her grip on the truth. The next day, she began her performance. She nodded when Dr. Brennan corrected her memories. She wrote grateful letters to Victoria that the staff read and approved. She took her medications without complaint, but learned to hide them under her tongue and spit them out later when no one was watching. Most importantly, she began to plan her escape. But Victoria and Marcus had planned for that possibility too. The night Sophia finally worked up the courage to run, she made it exactly 50 yards from the building before motion sensors triggered floodlights and alarms that could be heard for miles. The fall from the second-story window she'd been climbing through left her with 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and internal injuries that kept her unconscious for 3 days. When she woke up in the facility's medical wing, Victoria was sitting beside her bed like a grieving mother. "Oh, sweetheart," Victoria cooed for the benefit of the nurse nearby. "Why would you try to hurt yourself like that? Don't you know how much I love you?" Later, when they were alone, Victoria's mask dropped completely. "Did you really think you could run away from me?" Victoria asked, her voice as cold as winter steel. "I own this place, Sophia. I own the doctors, the staff, the local police. There is nowhere you can go that I won't find you. No one you can tell who will believe you over me." "Why?" Sophia whispered through her pain. "Why did you kill my daddy? Why are you doing this to me?" Victoria studied her with the detachment of a scientist examining a specimen. "Your father was worth more to me dead than alive. His company, his life insurance, his house, his reputation, all of it flows through me now. As for you," she shrugged, "you're a loose end, a witness. In 10 years, when you turn 18, there might be questions about how I've managed your inheritance. But if you're mentally incompetent, locked away in a facility because of your tragic breakdown after your father's suicide, well, then I keep control forever." Victoria stood and smoothed her designer skirt. "The beauty of this plan is that the more you tell the truth, the crazier you sound. Who's going to believe a mentally ill child over a respectable widow who sacrificed so much to care for her troubled stepdaughter?" As Victoria left, Sophia stared at the ceiling and felt something inside her die. Not her spirit, that remained unbroken, but her faith in the fundamental fairness of the world. She was 9 years old and she finally understood that sometimes the monsters not only won, but were rewarded for their cruelty. But she also understood something else that Victoria had overlooked in her calculations. Pain could destroy a person, or it could forge them into something stronger than they'd ever imagined possible. Victoria had assumed that breaking Sophia's hope would break her will to fight. Instead, it had taught her that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford, and that fighting was the only thing that mattered. Sophia closed her eyes and began to plan. Not another escape attempt. Those were doomed to failure. Instead, she would plan something much more dangerous and much more permanent. She would plan to survive long enough to destroy Victoria Sterling completely. The war was about to begin in earnest, and Victoria had no idea what she had created in the sterile halls of Sunrise Valley Treatment Center. Tommy Martinez had been carrying guilt like a lead weight in his chest for 8 months. At 17, he was old enough to understand that he had failed his half-sister when she needed him most, but young enough to believe he could still fix everything if he just tried hard enough. The boarding school in Vermont had become a prison of his own guilt and helplessness. Every day brought new reports about Sophia's treatment, carefully edited updates from Victoria that painted a picture of a deeply disturbed child who was slowly improving under professional care. The doctors say she's making progress, Victoria had told him during their last phone call. She's starting to accept that her father's death was a suicide, and she's becoming less aggressive toward the staff. They think she might be ready for limited family visits by Christmas. But something in Victoria's voice, a note of satisfaction that seemed wrong for someone discussing a child's recovery, triggered the same alarm bells that had been ringing in Tommy's head since Richard's funeral. The breaking point came when Tommy received a letter that was supposedly from Sophia. The handwriting was shaky, the words were stilted, and the content was completely unlike anything his spirited little sister would ever write. "Dear Tommy," the letter read, "I am doing much better now. The doctors have helped me understand that I was very sick after Daddy died. I made up stories about Victoria because I was sad and confused. Victoria is taking good care of me, and I am grateful for her help. Please don't worry about me anymore. Love, Sophia." Tommy read the letter 3 times, his anger growing with each word. This wasn't Sophia's voice. It was the voice of someone who had been broken and rebuilt according to someone else's specifications. That night, he made a decision that would change everything. Instead of returning to Vermont after Christmas break, he was going to Montana to see Sophia for himself. The journey to Sunrise Valley Treatment Center took him 2 days of driving through increasingly desolate country. When he finally reached the facility, his worst fears were confirmed. The place looked more like a prison than a hospital, with guard towers and electrified fences hidden behind carefully manicured landscaping. "I'm here to see my sister, Sophia Sterling," Tommy told the receptionist, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and the demeanor of someone who had learned not to ask too many questions. "Visiting hours are Sundays from 2 to 4 p.m., she replied without looking up. "You'll need to be on the approved visitor list." "I'm her brother." "Half-brother," the woman corrected, consulting her computer screen. "I'm sorry, but you're not on the approved list. Only legal guardians can authorize visits for patients in the secure wing." Tommy felt his heart sink. "Can I speak to someone in charge? Maybe if I explain the situation?" "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Unauthorized visitors can be very disruptive to our patients' treatment." That evening, Tommy sat in a cheap motel room 6 miles from the facility, planning his next move. If he couldn't get in through official channels, he would have to find another way. The break came when he met Sarah Mitchell, a local waitress at the diner where he was eating dinner. Sarah was 22, with the kind of world-weary expression that suggested she'd seen more than her share of the world's ugliness. "You're not from around here," she observed as she refilled his coffee cup. "Vermont. I'm trying to visit my sister at the treatment center." Sarah's expression darkened. "Sunrise Valley? That place is bad news. I worked there for 3 months before I quit." "Why did you quit?" Sarah glanced around the diner, making sure no one was listening. "Because what they do to those kids isn't treatment. It's systematic abuse designed to break their spirits and make them compliant." She sat down across from him, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They drug them into submission, punish them for telling the truth about their families, and use experimental treatments that aren't approved for children. I tried to report it to the state, but somehow my complaint got lost in the bureaucracy." "My sister is in there," Tommy said desperately. "She's only 9 years old, and I think her stepmother had her committed to keep her quiet about something." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of deception. Whatever she saw there convinced her to trust him. "There's a service entrance on the east side of the building," she said quietly. "The lock is broken. Has been for months. If you go in around midnight when they're changing shifts, you might be able to find her." That night, Tommy made his way through the Montana darkness toward Sunrise Valley. The facility looked even more sinister in the moonlight, its windows glowing with the cold light of fluorescent bulbs that never went out. The service entrance was exactly where Sarah had said it would be, and the lock was indeed broken. Tommy slipped inside, his heart pounding as he navigated unfamiliar corridors that smelled of industrial disinfectant and human despair. He found Sophia in a cell-like room in the secure wing, sitting on a narrow bed and staring at nothing. The vibrant, energetic girl he remembered had been replaced by a hollow-eyed child who seemed to have aged years in the 8 months since he'd last seen her. "Sophia," he whispered. She looked up slowly, as if the sound of her name was a half-remembered dream. When she saw him, her face crumpled with emotions too complex for a 9-year-old to bear. "Tommy," she whispered back, "are you real, or am I having another hallucination?" "I'm real, little bird," he said, using his childhood nickname for her. "I'm so sorry I didn't come sooner." For the next hour, Sophia told him everything. Victoria's systematic poisoning of their father, the fake psychiatric evaluation, the memory reconstruction therapy designed to make her doubt her own experiences. With each revelation, Tommy's anger grew until it felt like a living thing in his chest. But more than anger, he felt admiration for his little sister's strength. Despite months of systematic abuse, she had maintained her grip on the truth and found ways to resist the brainwashing without triggering punishments that would have made her situation even worse. "We're getting you out of here," Tommy promised. "Tonight." "They'll catch us," Sophia said. "They have motion sensors and cameras everywhere. Then we'll go to the police, the FBI, the newspapers. Someone will listen." Sophia's laugh was bitter beyond her years. "Victoria owns them all, Tommy, or threatens them. That's what she does. She finds what people are afraid of losing and uses it against them. Then what do? We get proof. Real proof that she can't explain away or cover up." Tommy helped Sophia think through their options. They needed evidence that would be impossible to dismiss or destroy, something that would expose Victoria's network of corruption and force the authorities to take action. "Dad's laptop," Sophia said suddenly. "He was suspicious of Victoria in his last few weeks. He might have been gathering evidence." They made plans to meet again the following night. Tommy would search their father's study for any evidence Richard might have hidden, while Sophia would try to record some of her therapy sessions to document the abuse. But Victoria Sterling had not built her criminal empire by being careless about security. The hidden cameras she'd installed throughout the facility had captured every moment of Tommy's visit, and by the time he reached his motel, she was already mobilizing her resources to neutralize this new threat. The next morning, Tommy received a phone call that changed everything. "Tommy Martinez?" The voice was official, businesslike. "This is Detective Williams with the Montana State Police. We need you to come to our office immediately. There's been an incident involving your sister." Tommy's blood turned to ice. "What kind of incident?" "I'd rather discuss this in person, son. Can you be here within the hour?" The drive to the police station felt like the longest hour of Tommy's life. By the time he arrived, Victoria was already there, dressed in black and dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "Oh, Tommy," she sobbed, throwing her arms around him. "It's so terrible. Sophia tried to hurt herself again. She's in the hospital, but the doctors aren't sure she's going to make it." Detective Williams was a tired-looking man in his 50s who had obviously dealt with too many family tragedies. "I'm sorry, son. Your sister apparently tried to hang herself in her room last night. The staff found her just in time, but she's in critical condition." Tommy knew immediately that it was a lie. Sophia would never try to kill herself. She was too angry, too determined to prove Victoria's guilt. This was Victoria's way of silencing her permanently while making it look like the tragic end to a mentally ill child's suffering. "I want to see her," Tommy demanded. "Of course," Victoria said quickly. "We'll go to the hospital together. The doctors want to keep her sedated for a few days while they assess the damage." At the hospital, Tommy stared through a window at his sister's unconscious form, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical life. Sophia looked smaller than ever in the hospital bed, her face pale and peaceful in a way that suggested heavy sedation rather than natural sleep. "The psychiatric team thinks this might be for the best," Victoria told him, her voice heavy with false sorrow. "If she survives, she'll need much more intensive treatment, possibly permanent residential care." That night, Tommy sat in his motel room and made the most important decision of his young life. If the authorities wouldn't listen to him, and if Victoria was powerful enough to silence Sophia permanently, Then he would have to find another way to expose the truth. He spent the next week systematically gathering evidence. He broke into Richard's study and found his father's laptop hidden behind a false panel in the basement office. The password was Sophia's birthday, or 18-2015. The laptop was a treasure trove of information. Richard had been suspicious of Victoria's behavior in his final months and had installed hidden recording software on his home security system. The files showed Victoria crushing pills and mixing them into Richard's coffee, recorded phone conversations with Marcus about expediting the timeline, and most damning of all, video footage of Victoria on the phone saying, "The insurance money comes through next week, then we implement phase 2 with the kid." Tommy copied everything to multiple flash drives and uploaded backups to cloud storage accounts. Then he contacted Detective Sarah Chen, an investigator he'd found through online research who specialized in suspicious deaths and had a reputation for not backing down from powerful people. Detective Chen was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who listened to Tommy's story without interruption, reviewing the evidence with professional skepticism that gradually transformed into grim determination. "This is solid," she admitted, "but Victoria Sterling has connections, money, lawyers. We need to be careful about how we proceed." Chen outlined a plan that would take weeks to implement properly. She would begin a formal investigation while Tommy maintained normal contact with Victoria. Meanwhile, Sophia would remain in the hospital under protective observation while they built their case. "How long?" Tommy asked. 6 weeks, maybe 8. "I know it seems like forever, but we need airtight evidence. Victoria's going to lawyer up the moment she gets wind of this investigation." As Tommy drove back toward Vermont that night, he felt lighter than he had in months. Finally, they were fighting back with real weapons and professional help. Sophia would be safe in the hospital, and soon Victoria would face justice for everything she'd done. He never saw the headlights of Marcus Sterling's truck until they smashed into his passenger door at 70 miles per hour. The crash site told a story of tragic inevitability. A young driver who had fallen asleep at the wheel after an emotional visit with his hospitalized sister, crossing the center line at high speed and hitting a tree with enough force to turn his car into twisted metal. There were no witnesses, no skid marks to suggest he'd tried to brake, no evidence of foul play that couldn't be explained by a single vehicle accident involving driver fatigue. When Detective Chen arrived at the crash scene 6 hours later, Tommy was barely alive and completely unconscious. The laptop and flash drives were nowhere to be found, and Tommy's phone had been destroyed beyond any hope of data recovery. Victoria appeared at the hospital within hours, playing the role of devastated stepmother to perfection. "Poor Tommy," she sobbed for the nurses and doctors. "He was so upset about Sophia's condition. I think the guilt was eating him alive." In Tommy's hospital room, Marcus stood over the unconscious teenager's broken body and smiled coldly. "Told you I was good at making accidents look real," he murmured to Victoria, "just like Richard's wife all those years ago." Back at the hospital where Sophia lay sedated, Victoria made arrangements for even more intensive treatment. If Tommy recovered, he would face months of rehabilitation for severe brain trauma. If he didn't recover, he would be quietly removed from life support after a suitable period of grieving. Either way, the last person who believed Sophia's story had been eliminated. As Victoria signed papers authorizing experimental brain surgery for her suicidal stepdaughter, she felt the satisfaction of a chess master who had anticipated every possible move. Sophia would survive the operation, but the child who woke up would have no memory of her father's murder or Victoria's crimes. The plan was perfect, elegant, and completely legal. What Victoria didn't anticipate was that sometimes the most broken people refuse to stay broken, and sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected directions. The war was about to enter its final phase, and neither Victoria nor Marcus had any idea what they had unleashed in their quest for the perfect crime. The courtroom in Helena, Montana, felt like a tomb where justice had come to die. Sophia sat between two court-appointed attorneys who had met her exactly 20 minutes before the hearing and who seemed more interested in their fee schedules than in her future. Judge Patricia Hayes presided over the proceedings with the cold efficiency of someone who had learned to see children as case numbers rather than human beings. At 55, Judge Hayes had built her career on pharmaceutical industry donations and had never met a psychiatric commitment she couldn't justify. The court will now hear testimony regarding the mental competency of Sophia Sterling, Judge Hayes announced, her gavel striking the bench with finality. Dr. Amanda Ross took the stand with the confidence of someone who had performed this particular theater many times before. Her testimony was a masterpiece of clinical manipulation, painting Sophia as a dangerous child whose delusions had escalated to life-threatening behavior. Following her brother's tragic accident, Dr. Ross testified, the defendant has shown complete dissociation from reality. She continues to insist that her stepmother murdered her father, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. More troubling, she has begun claiming that her brother's accident was also murder and that there is a vast conspiracy designed to silence her. Sophia listened to her own life being dissected and reconstructed into something unrecognizable. Every word she had spoken in therapy was twisted into evidence of madness. Every emotion she had expressed was pathologized. Every instinct she had about Victoria's guilt was presented as proof of her own mental illness. Furthermore, Dr. Ross continued, the patient attempted suicide twice while under residential treatment, including a recent incident that required emergency medical intervention. Her self-destructive behavior poses an immediate danger not only to herself but potentially to others. Victoria sat in the gallery, dressed in conservative black, her face a perfect mask of maternal concern. When Judge Hayes invited her to testify, Victoria approached the witness stand with the measured steps of someone carrying an unbearable burden. Your Honor, Victoria began, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. I have tried everything to help my stepdaughter. I've spent my life savings on the best psychiatric care available. I've consulted with experts across the country. I've devoted every waking moment to her recovery. She paused to dab her eyes with a tissue. But Sophia's condition continues to deteriorate. Her delusions have become more elaborate and violent. She has threatened staff members, attempted to harm herself repeatedly, and shows no recognition of reality. What is your recommendation, Mrs. Sterling? Judge Hayes asked. With a broken heart, Your Honor, I request that Sophia be transferred to Mountain View State Hospital for long-term psychiatric commitment. She needs intensive treatment that I can no longer provide as a private guardian. Sorry, Mountain View State Hospital wasn't a treatment facility. It was where Montana sent people it wanted to forget. Built in the 1950s and barely updated since, it housed the criminally insane, the profoundly mentally ill, and the politically inconvenient. Sophia would be its youngest resident in over 30 years. Judge Hayes reviewed the psychiatric reports with the speed of someone who had already made her decision. Based on the medical evidence presented and the guardian's testimony, I hereby order Sophia Sterling to be committed to Mountain View State Hospital for an indefinite period, with annual reviews to determine if her condition has improved sufficiently to warrant release. The gavel fell like a death sentence. At 9 years old, Sophia had been declared legally insane and condemned to spend her childhood in an institution that was one step away from being a prison. The transfer happened that afternoon. Sophia was loaded into a van with reinforced windows and driven 3 hours through increasingly desolate countryside. Mountain View sat on a windswept plateau like a monument to society's abandoned children, its brick walls stained with decades of neglect and its windows barred against both intrusion and escape. Her new home was a concrete cell 8 feet by 10 feet, containing a metal cot bolted to the floor, a stainless steel toilet, and nothing else. The walls were painted institutional green and covered with scratches and stains that told stories of previous occupants who had fought their own battles against the darkness. Welcome to Mountain View, little girl, said Orderly Williams, a massive man with scars on his knuckles and dead eyes that had seen too much violence. Here's how things work. You follow orders, take your medicine, and keep your mouth shut. You cause trouble, you go to the quiet room. You cause big trouble, you disappear. Understand? The daily routine was designed to break down human dignity systematically. Wake up at 5 a.m. for medication that turned thoughts to molasses. Stand in line for meals that barely qualified as food. Sit in group therapy sessions where patients were encouraged to confess their sins and express gratitude for the care they received. The other residents ranged from catatonic to violently psychotic. Sophia learned quickly to identify which patients were genuinely ill and which, like herself, had been committed for the crime of inconveniencing powerful people. There was Maria Santos, a teenage girl who had accused her stepfather of sexual abuse and been declared delusional when the family chose denial over justice. There was David Kim, a boy who had witnessed his mother's murder and been committed when his testimony threatened to implicate connected political figures. "The trick is to become invisible," Maria whispered to Sophia during their first group session. "Don't fight back. Don't ask questions. Don't give them any reason to notice you. The ones who fight back end up in the basement." "What's in the basement?" Sophia asked. Maria's eyes went flat and distant. "That's where they do the experimental treatments. Brain surgery, electric shock, drug trials that aren't approved for human use. People go down there and come back different, quieter. Sometimes they don't come back at all." But the worst part of Mountain View wasn't the physical conditions or the constant threat of violence. It was the systematic campaign to destroy Sophia's sense of self through medical torture disguised as treatment. Dr. Marcus Brennan, the facility's chief psychiatrist, specialized in what he called aggressive reality therapy. 3 times a week, Sophia was strapped to a chair in his office, while he used a combination of drugs and psychological manipulation to convince her that everything she believed about Victoria was false. "Your stepmother loves you very much," Dr. Brennan would say, as the drugs made Sophia's vision blur and her thoughts scatter. "She has sacrificed everything to help you get better. Your father died because he was sick and sad, not because anyone hurt him." "That's not true," Sophia would mumble through the chemical haze. "Your grief is making you remember things that never happened. Let's practice the correct memories. Your father was depressed. Victoria tried to save him. He chose to die because he couldn't bear his sadness anymore." The sessions would continue for hours, with Dr. Brennan patiently reconstructing Sophia's memories according to Victoria's preferred narrative. Day by day, week by week, the constant repetition began to erode her certainty about what had really happened. The breakthrough came 6 months into her commitment, when Sophia overheard Dr. Brennan talking to someone on his office phone during one of their sessions. "The Sterling girl is responding well to the enhanced protocol," he was saying. "Another few months and she'll believe whatever we tell her to believe. Yes, the Guardian is very pleased with our progress. She's authorized additional funding for the experimental procedures." Sophia felt like she was drowning in her own drug confusion, but that moment of clarity cut through the fog like a searchlight. Victoria wasn't trying to cure her. She was paying to have her mind systematically destroyed. From that day forward, Sophia began to fight back in the only way available to her. She pretended the brainwashing was working while secretly maintaining her grip on the truth. She took her medication without complaint, but learned to hide the pills under her tongue and spit them out later. She wrote grateful letters to Victoria that the staff read and approved, while planning how she would one day expose every crime Victoria had committed. But Victoria had planned for resistance too. The night Sophia attempted to escape through a bathroom window, she made it exactly 30 yards before motion sensors triggered floodlights and alarms that brought the entire security staff running. The punishment was swift and brutal. Dr. Brennan ordered her transferred to the basement level, where the most dangerous patients were kept in isolation. Her new cell was smaller, darker, and located directly beneath the experimental treatment rooms, where screams echoed through the ventilation system at all hours. "I'm very disappointed in you, Sophia," Dr. Brennan said as they strapped her to a new kind of chair, equipped with restraints that left her completely immobilized. "Clearly, our previous approach wasn't intensive enough." The new treatment protocol involved drugs that Sophia had never experienced before. Chemicals that didn't just cloud her thinking, but seemed to attack her very sense of self. Combined with sensory deprivation and constant exposure to recordings of Victoria's voice expressing love and concern, the treatments were designed to completely rewrite Sophia's personality. After 3 months in the basement, Sophia barely remembered her own name. The drugs had stolen her ability to think clearly. The isolation had made her forget what human connection felt like, and the constant psychological assault had convinced her that maybe she really was crazy. It was during one of these sessions that Victoria made her final visit to Mountain View. Sophia was unconscious when Victoria entered the basement treatment room, her small body strapped to the medical chair, while Dr. Brennan made notes about her progress. "How much longer?" Victoria asked, studying Sophia's unconscious form with clinical detachment. "Another month, perhaps 2, Dr. Brennan replied. "The memory reconstruction is nearly complete." When she wakes up, she'll have no recollection of her father's death beyond what we've programmed her to remember. And the other memories? Her childhood? Her relationship with her brother? Selectively edited. She'll remember being loved and cared for by you, being troubled and confused before treatment, and being grateful for your patience with her illness. Victoria nodded with satisfaction. What about her inheritance? Will she be competent enough to sign financial documents? Oh, yes. She'll be completely functional in that regard. Grateful, obedient, and absolutely convinced that you saved her life. As Victoria prepared to leave, something made her look back at Sophia's unconscious face. For just a moment, she saw not the broken shell of a child they had created, but the vibrant, intelligent girl who had once threatened to expose her crimes. Make sure it's permanent, Victoria said quietly. I don't want any possibility of her original memories returning. I understand, Dr. Brennan replied. By the time we're finished, Sophia Sterling will be exactly the daughter you want her to be. But as Victoria's footsteps echoed down the basement corridor, neither she nor Dr. Brennan noticed the slight movement of Sophia's fingers against the chair's restraints. Deep inside her drugged consciousness, something indestructible still burned. Not memory, not hope, but pure stubborn refusal to surrender. Victoria Sterling thought she had won completely. She had murdered Richard, eliminated Tommy, and was on the verge of erasing Sophia's mind entirely. In a few weeks, she would have a grateful, obedient daughter and complete control over $50 million. The plan was perfect, elegant, and seemingly unstoppable. What Victoria didn't understand was that some flames can't be extinguished, no matter how much darkness you pour on them. And sometimes, just when evil thinks it has achieved total victory, the light finds a way to fight back. The final battle was about to begin, and it would come from a direction that Victoria Sterling never saw coming. Dr. Emma Rodriguez had built her career on cases that other professionals wouldn't touch. Children who had been written off by the system, families torn apart by corruption, institutions that hid abuse behind medical authority. At 42, she was one of the country's leading experts on psychiatric malpractice, and she had spent the last 5 years building a case against facilities like Mountain View. The letter that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday morning, mixed in with her usual correspondence from desperate families and whistleblowing staff members. But this letter was different. It came from Detective Sarah Chen of the Montana State Police, and it contained information that made Dr. Rodriguez's blood run cold. Dr. Rodriguez, the letter began, I am writing to request your assistance with a case that I believe involves systematic psychiatric abuse of a minor. The child in question, Sophia Sterling, age 9, has been committed to Mountain View State Hospital under circumstances that I believe warrant investigation. Chen went on to detail her investigation into Richard Sterling's death, the suspicious circumstances surrounding Tommy Martinez's accident, and the systematic elimination of anyone who had tried to help Sophia. Most importantly, she included copies of the evidence that Tommy had gathered before his accident, recordings, financial documents, and medical records that painted a picture of calculated murder and institutional corruption. I have been unable to gain access to the child through official channels, Chen's letter continued. Victoria Sterling has powerful connections throughout the state legal system, and my direct supervisor has ordered me to close the Sterling case. However, I believe that a psychiatric evaluation conducted by an independent expert might reveal evidence of abuse that would force federal intervention. Dr. Rodriguez read the letter 3 times, her anger growing with each word. She had seen variations of this story before. Powerful adults using the psychiatric system to silence inconvenient children, but never with such systematic brutality. That afternoon, she placed a call to Detective Chen. I've reviewed your materials, Dr. Rodriguez said without preamble. If even half of what you suspect is true, we're looking at one of the most sophisticated child abuse conspiracies I've ever encountered. Can you help? I can do better than that. I have state authorization to conduct random facility inspections, and Mountain View is overdue for a visit. The question is, are you prepared for what we might find? What do you mean? If Victoria Sterling has been paying to have this child's mind destroyed, we may be looking at permanent psychological damage. Sophia Sterling may not be the same person she was before the abuse began. Chen's voice was steady. Then we owe it to her to try to bring back as much as we can. The inspection was scheduled for the following week, during a winter storm that would provide cover for their activities. Dr. Rodriguez arrived at Mountain View with a team of forensic psychiatrists and a court order that gave them unrestricted access to patient records and treatment facilities. Director Harrison met them at the gate with obvious reluctance and barely concealed hostility. "This is highly irregular," he complained as icy wind whipped across the hospital grounds. "We received no advance notice of this inspection. State regulations don't require advance notice for psychiatric evaluations." Dr. Rodriguez replied crisply, "Unless you have something to hide?" The tour began in the administrative wing, where everything was clean, professional, and designed to impress visiting officials. But Dr. Rodriguez had conducted enough of these inspections to recognize a show when she saw one. "I'd like to see the residential areas," she announced, "particularly the secure wing where your most challenging patients are housed." Harrison's smile became strained. "I'm afraid many of our patients are in a very fragile state. Unexpected visitors could be quite traumatic. State law requires patient access during inspections," Detective Chen interjected, her hand resting meaningfully on her service weapon. "I'm sure you wouldn't want to obstruct an official investigation." As they moved deeper into the facility, the facade began to crack. Patients shuffled through corridors like zombies, many showing obvious signs of overmedication. The smell of unwashed bodies and industrial disinfectant hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and the sound of muffled screaming drifted up from what Harrison claimed were therapy rooms. They found Sophia in the basement isolation ward, in a cell that should have been condemned decades ago. She was sitting on a concrete floor, her back against the wall, staring at nothing with the hollow expression of someone who had retreated so far inside themselves that the outside world had ceased to exist. Dr. Rodriguez knelt down beside the child, her heart breaking at what she saw. Sophia was emaciated, her hospital gown hanging like a tent on her skeletal frame. Her hair had been shaved off, and her arms were covered with injection marks from months of forced medication. "Sophia," Dr. Rodriguez said softly, "my name is Dr. Rodriguez. I'm here to help you." Sophia's eyes moved slowly toward the sound, but there was no recognition in them, no spark of intelligence or hope. The drugs had stolen not just her memories, but her very sense of self. "Can you tell me your name?" Dr. Rodriguez asked. "Sophia," came the mechanical response. "I am grateful for Victoria's care. I was very sick, but the doctors made me better." Dr. Rodriguez felt Detective Chen's hand on her shoulder, and she looked up to see tears in the officer's eyes. This wasn't a child anymore. It was a shell that had been programmed to recite responses that would satisfy her abusers. "We need to get her out of here immediately," Dr. Rodriguez whispered, "and we need to document everything we've seen." The next 6 hours were a whirlwind of activity. Dr. Rodriguez's team photographed the basement facilities, interviewed staff members who were too frightened to speak on the record, and documented the systematic abuse that had been disguised as medical treatment. Most importantly, they removed Sophia from Mountain View and transported her to Denver Children's Hospital, where a team of specialists began the delicate process of detoxification and evaluation. "The level of psychiatric medication in her system is off the charts," Dr. Martinez, the emergency room physician, told Dr. Rodriguez after Sophia's initial examination. "She's been given drugs that should never be administered to children in combinations that could have killed her." "What about psychological damage?" "Too early to tell. The memory reconstruction therapy you described could have caused permanent damage to her ability to form coherent narratives about her own life. We'll need weeks, maybe months, to determine how much of her original personality can be recovered." While Sophia underwent medical treatment, Dr. Rodriguez and Detective Chen were building a federal case that would bring down Victoria's entire network. The evidence they had gathered at Mountain View was devastating. Falsified medical records, financial documents showing payments for experimental treatments, and recorded conversations between Victoria and facility staff discussing Sophia's programming. But Victoria Sterling was not the kind of woman who accepted defeat gracefully. Within hours of Sophia's removal from Mountain View, Victoria's lawyers had filed emergency motions, claiming that Sophia had been kidnapped by rogue medical professionals who were interfering with her court-ordered treatment. Mrs. Sterling, Dr. Rodriguez said when Victoria confronted her in the hospital lobby, your stepdaughter has been subjected to systematic medical abuse. We have documented evidence of... You have documented evidence of nothing, Victoria interrupted, her composure finally cracking. That child is my legal ward, and she was receiving appropriate treatment for severe mental illness. What you've done is kidnapping, and I intend to see you prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The FBI disagrees, Detective Chen said quietly, stepping out from behind a pillar where she had been waiting. Agent Rebecca Torres. Meet Victoria Sterling. Agent Torres was a woman in her 40s with the kind of steely determination that came from years of fighting corruption at the highest levels. She had been building a case against pharmaceutical companies that profited from institutional abuse, and Victoria's network was exactly the break she had been hoping for. Victoria Sterling, Agent Torres said, producing a set of handcuffs, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, child abuse, fraud, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent. Victoria's mask of respectability finally shattered completely. You have no idea what you're dealing with, she snarled as the handcuffs clicked into place. I have judges, prosecutors, politicians in my pocket. This won't stick. Actually, Agent Torres smiled, your brother Marcus has been very helpful in explaining exactly how your operation worked. Turns out he's not as loyal as you thought when faced with federal murder charges. Victoria's face went white. Marcus had been arrested 3 hours earlier at his compound in Wyoming, and when confronted with evidence of multiple murders spanning 5 years, he had broken completely and confessed to everything in exchange for life in prison instead of the death penalty. As Victoria was led away in handcuffs, Dr. Rodriguez returned to Sophia's hospital room. The child was awake but still heavily sedated, her eyes tracking movement but showing no recognition of her surroundings. Sophia, Dr. Rodriguez said gently, my name is Dr. Rodriguez. You're safe now. Victoria can't hurt you anymore. Sophia's lips moved almost imperceptibly. Dr. Rodriguez leaned closer to hear what she was trying to say. Daddy, Sophia whispered, the word barely audible. I want my daddy. It was the first spontaneous response Sophia had given since her rescue, and Dr. Rodriguez felt a surge of hope. Somewhere inside the program's shell, the real Sophia Sterling was still fighting to survive. Your daddy loved you very much, Dr. Rodriguez said softly, and he would be so proud of how brave you've been. Over the following weeks, as the drugs slowly cleared from Sophia's system, fragments of her original personality began to emerge. She remembered her father's laugh, her brother's nickname for her, the birthday party that now seemed like it had happened to someone else. But the memories of Victoria's crimes remained fragmented and confused, mixed with the false narratives that had been systematically implanted through months of psychological torture. It's going to take time, Dr. Rodriguez explained to Jake Thompson, who had finally found the courage to visit Sophia after Victoria's arrest. The human mind has remarkable healing abilities, but what they did to her was designed to be permanent. Jake sat beside Sophia's bed, watching her sleep and struggling with his own guilt over abandoning her when she needed him most. Will she ever be the same? No, Dr. Rodriguez said honestly, but she might become something even stronger. Trauma can destroy a person, but it can also forge them into someone who fights to protect others from experiencing the same pain. As if summoned by their conversation, Sophia's eyes opened. She looked around the room with growing awareness, taking in the clean walls, the natural light from the windows, the absence of bars and restraints. Is it real? She asked, her voice still hoarse from disuse. Or am I dreaming again? It's real, Dr. Rodriguez assured her. You're in Denver Children's Hospital. You're safe. Victoria's in prison, and she can never hurt you again. Sophia processed this information slowly, her face cycling through emotions too complex for a 10-year-old to fully understand. What about Tommy? She asked suddenly. Is Tommy okay? Dr. Rodriguez exchanged a glance with Jake. Tommy had survived his accident but with severe brain trauma that had left him with significant memory loss and physical disabilities. He was in a rehabilitation facility in Portland, slowly learning to walk and speak again. Tommy is alive, Dr. Rodriguez said carefully. He was hurt very badly, but he's getting better. When you're strong enough, we'll arrange for you to see him. Sophia nodded, accepting this news with the strange calm of someone who had learned not to expect happy endings. Dr. Rodriguez, Sophia said after a long pause, what happens to me now? It was a question that would define the rest of Sophia's life, and Dr. Rodriguez chose her words carefully. Now, she said, you get to decide who you want to become. You've survived something that would have broken most adults. You have a choice. You can let what happened to you define your life, or you can use your experience to help other children who are facing the same kind of evil. Sophia considered this for a long moment, her young face serious beyond her years. I want to help other kids, she said finally. I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through. Dr. Rodriguez smiled, seeing for the first time a glimpse of the remarkable woman Sophia might become. Then that's exactly what we'll help you do. Outside Sophia's window, the Colorado sun was setting over the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the distance, other children were trapped in institutions like Mountain View, suffering abuse that was sanctioned by the very system designed to protect them. But for the first time in over a year, Sophia Sterling was free. And freedom, she was beginning to understand, meant the power to fight back. The federal courthouse in Denver had never seen a case quite like United States versus Victoria Sterling. The charges read like a catalog of human cruelty: conspiracy to commit murder, child abuse, medical malpractice, fraud, racketeering, and operating a criminal enterprise. The evidence filled 17 boxes and included recordings, financial documents, medical records, and testimony from over 30 witnesses. Sophia sat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by Dr. Rodriguez and Jake Thompson, who had been granted temporary guardianship while the legal proceedings played out. At 10 years old, she was too young to testify in person, but her recorded statements to FBI investigators would be played for the jury. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Barnes, was a veteran of white-collar crime cases who had volunteered for this assignment after reading the initial evidence. In his opening statement, he painted a picture of systematic evil that left the courtroom in stunned silence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Barnes began, over the next 2 weeks, you will hear evidence of a conspiracy so calculated and cruel that it challenges our basic assumptions about human nature. The defendant, Victoria Sterling, didn't simply commit murder for money. She built an entire system designed to torture and exploit vulnerable children. He clicked a remote, and Richard Sterling's photograph appeared on a large screen. Richard Sterling was a successful businessman, a loving father, and by all accounts, a man in good health. Within 6 months of marrying Victoria Sterling, he was dead from what appeared to be a heart attack brought on by stress and depression. The next slide showed Sophia's school photo from before her father's death. A bright, smiling child with intelligent eyes and an expression of complete trust in the world around her. Sophia Sterling was 8 years old when her father died. She witnessed suspicious behavior from her stepmother, overheard incriminating conversations, and tried to tell adults what she had seen. For her honesty, she was systematically drugged, psychologically tortured, and held prisoner in institutions that masqueraded as medical facilities. Barnes outlined Victoria's method with clinical precision. Identify wealthy widowers with children from previous marriages, marry them, isolate them from friends and family, then slowly poison them while building a case for their mental instability. After their deaths, the children would be declared mentally ill and committed to facilities where they could be silenced permanently. The evidence will show that Victoria Sterling didn't just murder Richard Sterling, Barnes continued. She attempted to murder his son, Tommy Martinez, when he tried to investigate his father's death. She paid doctors to falsify psychiatric evaluations. She funded experimental medical procedures that were designed not to heal, but to destroy a child's ability to remember or testify about her crimes. Victoria's defense team, led by renowned criminal attorney David Walsh, faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against their client was overwhelming, and Marcus Sterling's confession had eliminated any possibility of claiming innocence. Their strategy was to paint Victoria as a victim of her brother's manipulation, a grieving widow who had been coerced into criminal behavior by a dangerous man with military training and pharmaceutical connections. My client is not the monster the prosecution wants you to believe, Walsh argued in his opening statement. Victoria Sterling is a woman who fell in love with the wrong man. First with Richard Sterling, who was already showing signs of mental illness when she married him, and then with her brother Marcus, who exploited her grief and convinced her to participate in a scheme she didn't fully understand. But as the trial progressed, it became clear that the evidence told a very different story. FBI forensic accountants had traced the financial trail of Victoria's crimes, showing systematic planning that went back years before she ever met Richard Sterling. Agent Rebecca Torres testified about discovering a network of corrupt institutions across 7 states, all connected to pharmaceutical companies that Victoria had financial ties to. Dr. Emma Rodriguez provided devastating testimony about the systematic abuse she had documented at Mountain View, including photographs of Sophia's condition when she was rescued. The most damaging evidence came from the recordings that Marcus had made during his cooperation with federal investigators. In conversation after conversation, Victoria's voice could be heard planning murders, discussing the logistics of covering up crimes, and expressing satisfaction at the systematic destruction of children's minds. "The girl is responding well to the enhanced protocol," Victoria's voice said in one recording. "Dr. Brennan thinks another few months and she'll believe whatever we tell her to believe. Perfect little zombie who'll sign whatever papers we put in front of her." When it came time for Sophia's recorded testimony to be played, the courtroom fell completely silent. The child's voice, still hoarse from months of forced medication, described her father's gradual decline, Victoria's suspicious behavior, and the systematic abuse she had endured in multiple institutions. "I knew she killed my daddy," Sophia's recorded voice said with devastating clarity. "I saw the text messages about poison. I heard her laughing about how fast it was working, but every time I told someone, they said I was crazy and gave me more drugs." The recording continued for over an hour, with Sophia providing details about the memory reconstruction therapy, the experimental medications, and the constant psychological pressure to renounce her own experiences and accept Victoria's version of events. Victoria sat through the playback with perfect composure, her face a mask of maternal concern. Only someone watching very carefully would have noticed the slight smile that played at the corners of her mouth when Sophia described the most brutal aspects of her treatment. The prosecution's final witness was Tommy Martinez, who had been transported from his rehabilitation facility in Portland specifically to testify. The young man who took the stand bore little resemblance to the confident teenager who had tried to save his sister 2 years earlier. The brain trauma from his accident had left him with significant speech difficulties and memory problems, but his core memories of the events leading up to the crash remained intact. "I found the evidence," Tommy said slowly, struggling with words that had once come easily. "Dad's computer, recordings of Victoria, poisoning him." "What happened to that evidence?" Prosecutor Barnes asked gently. "Stolen. When Marcus ran me off the road." Tommy's hands shook as he spoke. "They tried to kill me because I knew the truth." Victoria's attorney cross-examined Tommy aggressively, trying to suggest that his memories were unreliable due to his brain injury. But Tommy's core testimony remained consistent, and his obvious struggles only made his courage in testifying more compelling to the jury. The defense called only 3 witnesses: a psychiatrist who testified about the effects of grief on childhood memory, a character witness who described Victoria's charitable work before her marriage to Richard, and Victoria herself. Victoria's testimony was a masterpiece of manipulation. She portrayed herself as a loving stepmother who had been overwhelmed by Sophia's severe mental illness and had trusted medical professionals to provide appropriate care. "I love that little girl like my own daughter," Victoria said, tears streaming down her face. "When she started having delusions about Richard's death, I was heartbroken. I tried everything to help her: therapy, medication, residential treatment. I would have done anything to bring back the happy child she had been before the trauma." But under cross-examination, Prosecutor Barnes systematically dismantled Victoria's facade. He played recordings of her conversations with Marcus, showed financial documents proving her profit from Richard's death, and confronted her with evidence of the systematic planning that had gone into her crimes. "Mrs. Sterling," Barnes said, "you've testified that you love Sophia like your own daughter. Is that why you authorized experimental brain surgery designed to destroy her memories?" "I was following medical advice." Medical advice that you paid for? From doctors who were financially dependent on your pharmaceutical investments? Victoria's composure finally cracked. That child was a threat to everything I had worked for, she snarled. She was going to destroy my life with her lies and accusations. I did what I had to do to protect myself. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Victoria's own attorney looked stunned as his client destroyed any possibility of sympathy from the jury. So you admit that Sophia's accusations were not lies? Barnes pressed. Victoria realized her mistake too late. That's not what I meant. You authorized the systematic torture of a 9-year-old child because she was telling the truth about your crimes. Isn't that correct? Objection! Victoria's attorney shouted. But the damage was done. In his closing argument, Prosecutor Barnes summarized the case with devastating clarity. Victoria Sterling is not a grieving widow who made mistakes. She is a predator who built a system designed to murder for profit and silence the witnesses through medical torture. The only question for this jury is whether we, as a society, will hold her accountable for crimes that shock the conscience. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, the forewoman stood and delivered verdicts that would echo through the legal system for years to come. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of child abuse resulting in serious bodily injury, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of medical malpractice with intent to cause permanent harm, we find the defendant guilty. The litany continued for 17 separate charges. Victoria Sterling was found guilty on every count. Judge Samuel Martinez, who had presided over the trial with careful attention to both justice and procedure, sentenced Victoria to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 200 years for the child abuse charges. Mrs. Sterling, Judge Martinez said as he delivered the sentence, you have committed crimes that represent the worst of human nature, the systematic torture of an innocent child for financial gain. This court can conceive of no punishment that would be adequate to address the suffering you have caused, but we can ensure that you will never again have the opportunity to harm another child. As Victoria was led away in shackles, she turned one final time toward Sophia, who was sitting in the gallery with Dr. Rodriguez and Jake Thompson. For a moment, the mask slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation that had driven her to destroy so many lives. You won, Victoria said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. But you'll never be normal. What I did to you in those hospitals will follow you forever. Sophia stood up, her voice clear and strong despite her small stature. You're right. I'll never be normal. But I'll be something better. I'll be someone who fights for kids who can't fight for themselves. The courtroom erupted in applause as Victoria was dragged away, her perfect facade finally shattered beyond repair. Justice had been served, but for Sophia, the real work was just beginning. 1 year after Victoria's conviction, Sophia stood on the front steps of a renovated Victorian mansion in Boulder, Colorado, reading the brass plaque that had been installed that morning, the Sterling Foundation for Exploited Children, in memory of Richard Sterling and in honor of all children who refused to stay silent. At 11 years old, Sophia was still small for her age, the long months of medical abuse having taken a permanent toll on her physical development. But there was something in her eyes now that hadn't been there during the darkest days at Mountain View. A sense of purpose that burned bright and steady, like a flame that had been tested by the worst winds and emerged stronger. Jake Thompson emerged from the house carrying a box of legal documents, his face showing the strain of the past year's legal battles. Becoming Sophia's legal guardian had been only the beginning of a process that had required congressional hearings, federal investigations, and a complete overhaul of the systems that had failed her so completely. The final insurance settlement came through this morning, Jake told her, setting the box down on the front steps. $52 million from your father's estate, plus another $30 million in damages from the pharmaceutical companies. The foundation will have more funding than we ever dreamed possible. Dr. Rodriguez joined them, carrying a stack of case files that represented their first clients, children who had been trapped in the same network of corrupt institutions that had held Sophia. Each file told a story of systematic abuse disguised as medical treatment, of families torn apart by greed and corruption, of children who had been written off as hopeless cases. 17 children ready for evaluation, Dr. Rodriguez announced, ages 6 to 16. Most of them have been institutionalized for over 2 years, and their families have been told they're too dangerous or too mentally ill to ever come home. Tommy appeared in the doorway, moving slowly with the help of a walker, but grinning with genuine happiness for the first time since his accident. The rehabilitation process had been long and difficult, but his core personality had survived the brain trauma, and his determination to help Sophia had become the driving force in his recovery. The legal team is ready, Tommy said, his speech still slightly slurred, but much clearer than it had been 6 months earlier. We've got child advocates, psychiatric experts, and enough lawyers to take on the entire corrupt system. Sophia walked through the house that would serve as their headquarters, thinking about the children who were still trapped in places like Mountain View. The foundation would provide legal advocacy, independent medical evaluations, and safe housing for kids who had been failed by every institution that was supposed to protect them. But more than that, it would be proof that survivors could become warriors, that the most broken people could become the strongest healers, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against evil was simply refusing to stay silent. The first case came to them through Detective Sarah Chen, who had been quietly building her own network of law enforcement officials willing to challenge institutional corruption. Her name is Maria Santos, Chen explained as she placed a thick file on Sophia's desk. 15 years old, been in residential treatment for 3 years after she accused her stepfather of sexual abuse. The family had her committed when she refused to recant her story. Sophia studied Maria's photograph. A girl with dark eyes that held the same hollow look Sophia remembered from her own time in the system. Where is she now? Riverside Residential Treatment Center in Utah. Same pharmaceutical company that owned Mountain View. Same experimental drug protocols, same systematic destruction of children's minds. We'll get her out, Sophia said with quiet certainty, and then we'll shut them down. Over the following months, the Sterling Foundation developed a methodology that combined legal advocacy with public pressure and media attention. They would identify children who had been wrongfully committed, gather evidence of institutional abuse, and then launch coordinated campaigns that made it impossible for the corrupt system to ignore them. The first major victory came when they successfully secured the release of 8 children from Riverside, including Maria Santos. The media coverage of their rescue, emaciated children being carried out of what was supposed to be a medical facility, sparked congressional hearings and federal investigations that would eventually shut down the entire network. But the most important moment came when Maria, after months of detoxification and therapy, was able to tell her story publicly for the first time. They told me I was crazy for accusing my stepfather, Maria said during a press conference at the foundation. They said the memories of abuse were delusions, that the drugs would help me accept reality. But the only reality was that powerful people can buy silence, and children's voices don't matter unless someone with money and influence decides to listen. She looked directly into the cameras. The Sterling Foundation listened to me. They believed me. And now my stepfather is in prison where he belongs, and I'm free to tell the truth about what happened to me. The foundation grew rapidly, attracting donations from across the country and support from celebrities, politicians, and child welfare advocates who had been looking for an organization willing to take on the most difficult cases. Within 2 years, they had offices in 8 states and had successfully secured the release of over 200 children from abusive institutions. They had also forced the closure of 12 facilities and secured the criminal prosecution of dozens of doctors, administrators, and officials who had profited from child abuse. But for Sophia, the most meaningful victory was personal. On a warm spring morning, she received a call that Tommy had been eagerly waiting for. "Sophia!" Jake's voice was filled with excitement. "The Supreme Court just upheld the federal ruling. Every child in institutional care now has the right to independent legal representation, and no psychiatric commitment can be extended without evidence from at least 2 independent medical experts." The Sterling Act, as it had come to be known, was comprehensive legislation that revolutionized how the nation treated institutionalized children. Named in honor of her father, it mandated independent advocacy for every child in residential care, required video monitoring of all therapy sessions, and created federal criminal penalties for officials who profited from child abuse. "Dad would be proud," Tommy said, tears in his eyes as he listened to the news reports about the Supreme Court decision. I think he'd be amazed, Sophia replied. When he wrote those letters, he probably never imagined his 8-year-old daughter would end up changing federal law. That evening, at a celebration dinner with their team of lawyers, doctors, and advocates, Sophia reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened child who had been thrown out of her home after her father's funeral had become a force for justice that corrupt institutions across the country had learned to fear. "What's next?" a reporter asked during the brief press conference after dinner. "International expansion," Sophia replied without hesitation. "Child exploitation isn't just an American problem. There are kids suffering in institutions around the world who need advocates." Dr. Rodriguez smiled. "Any concerns about taking on such a massive challenge?" Sophia's answer reflected the wisdom she had gained through surviving the worst that humanity could offer. "Victoria Sterling taught me something important," she said. "She showed me that evil is systematic, organized, and patient. So if we're going to fight it, we have to be more systematic, more organized, and more patient than they are." She gestured toward the assembled crowd of survivors, advocates, lawyers, and medical professionals who had dedicated their lives to protecting children. "Every person in this room is proof that healing is possible, that justice is achievable, and that survivors can become warriors. We are the adults we needed when we were children, and we will continue fighting until every kid has someone who believes their story and fights for their freedom." The applause was thunderous, but Sophia barely heard it. She was thinking about her father's letters, about the promise she had made to turn her pain into purpose. Looking around the room at all the lives that had been changed, all the children who were safe tonight because someone had refused to give up on them, she knew she had kept that promise. The little girl who had been kicked out by her stepmother after her father's funeral had grown up to become exactly what the world needed: a voice for the voiceless, a fighter for the forgotten, and proof that sometimes the most broken people become the strongest healers. 5 years after Victoria Sterling's conviction, Sophia Sterling stood before the United Nations Commission on the Rights of the Child in Geneva, Switzerland. At 16, she had become the youngest person ever to address the Commission on Systematic Child Abuse, and her testimony was being broadcast live to an audience of millions around the world. "Honorable Commissioners," Sophia began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had survived the worst that institutions could inflict. "I stand before you today not just as a survivor, but as a representative of thousands of children whose voices have been silenced by systems that profit from their suffering." The assembly hall was packed with delegates, child welfare advocates, and journalists from around the world. In the front row sat Tommy, now 23, and walking with only a slight limp, Dr. Rodriguez, Jake Thompson, and Maria Santos, who had become the Foundation's Director of Survivor Services. "The Sterling Foundation has now documented institutional child abuse in 47 countries," Sophia continued. "Children as young as 5 have been drugged into compliance, isolated from their families, and used as test subjects for experimental treatments, all while generating billions in profit for corrupt officials and pharmaceutical companies." She clicked a remote, and photographs appeared on screens throughout the assembly hall. Children in restraints, facilities that looked more like prisons than hospitals, medical records showing systematic drugging of minors for non-medical purposes. These images were taken at facilities that claimed to provide therapeutic treatment for troubled children. What they actually provide is systematic torture designed to break children's spirits and steal their voices. The presentation continued for an hour, with Sophia providing detailed documentation of the global network of corruption that the Sterling Foundation had uncovered. Pharmaceutical companies that funded experimental research on children, government officials who took bribes to ignore abuse reports, medical professionals who falsified psychiatric evaluations to justify profitable treatments. "The Commission has the power to mandate international standards for child protection," Sophia concluded. "But standards without enforcement are meaningless. We need international tribunals with the authority to prosecute child abusers who cross borders to escape justice." During the question period that followed, a delegate from one of the countries where the foundation had documented abuse stood to challenge Sophia's testimony. "Miss Sterling," the delegate said, "these are very serious accusations. Do you have concrete evidence to support claims of systematic abuse?" Sophia's smile was sharp as winter steel. I have something better than evidence, sir. I have witnesses. The assembly hall doors opened, and a line of young people began filing in. Survivors from institutions around the world who had been rescued by the Sterling Foundation. They ranged in age from 10 to 25, representing dozens of countries and cultures, but they all shared the same look of quiet determination. Each of these survivors has provided sworn testimony about their experiences, Sophia announced. Their stories are documented, verified, and available to any member of this commission who genuinely wants to protect children rather than protect institutions. Hariyenon. One by one, the survivors approached the microphone and shared their stories. A girl from Romania who had been institutionalized for reporting sexual abuse, a boy from Thailand who had been used in pharmaceutical experiments, a teenager from Australia who had been committed for refusing to accept his parents' religious beliefs. The cumulative impact of their testimony was devastating. By the time the last survivor had spoken, several delegates were in tears, and the commission chairman was calling for an emergency session to draft immediate protective measures. That evening, at a reception for child welfare advocates, Sophia found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened 8-year-old who had been drugged and tortured for telling the truth had become an internationally recognized advocate whose foundation had fundamentally changed how the world approached child protection. Regrets? Dr. Rodriguez asked, joining Sophia on the hotel balcony overlooking Lake Geneva. About what? About losing your childhood. About having to become an adult when you were still supposed to be playing with toys. Sophia considered the question carefully. I think about that sometime, she admitted, but then I remember that my childhood was stolen the night Victoria killed my father. Nothing I could have done would have changed that. But you could have chosen bitterness instead of purpose. Victoria taught me something important about bitterness, Sophia replied. She showed me that holding on to hate destroys the person carrying it more than the person it's aimed at. I decided I'd rather be destroyed by love than by hate. Jake Thompson appeared in the doorway, carrying a folder thick with legal documents. The commission just voted, he announced with obvious satisfaction. Unanimous approval for the International Child Protection Protocol. Every signatory nation will be required to provide independent legal representation for institutionalized children and submit to unannounced inspections by international teams. Tommy joined them, moving carefully but with obvious pride. The Sterling Protocol, he said, grinning at his sister, has a nice ring to it. Dad would have loved this, Sophia said, looking out over the lake where the lights of Geneva twinkled like stars. He always believed that truth was stronger than lies and that justice was worth fighting for. He also believed in you, Dr. Rodriguez added. Even when you were 8 years old and the whole world seemed to be against you, he knew you had the strength to survive and the courage to fight back. That night, Sophia sat in her hotel room writing in the journal she had kept since her rescue from Mountain View. The entries chronicled not just her own healing journey, but the stories of hundreds of children who had found their voices through the Foundation's work. Day 847 since rescue, she wrote. The UN Commission voted to implement international child protection standards today. Victoria always said that nobody would believe a crazy little girl. She was wrong. People believe us now because we learned to make ourselves impossible to ignore. She paused, thinking about Victoria Sterling, who had died in prison 3 months earlier. The official cause was suicide, but Sophia suspected that someone in the prison had decided that justice required more than just life imprisonment. I used to wonder if I would feel satisfaction when Victoria died, Sophia continued writing. Instead, I felt sadness, not for her, but for all the children who might have been saved if she had chosen differently. Evil is always a choice, just like healing is a choice. The next morning brought news that would define the next phase of Sophia's mission. A pharmaceutical executive in Belgium had been arrested for funding experimental research on institutionalized children, and the evidence suggested connections to companies in 12 other countries. Looks like we have our next case, Maria Santos said as she handed Sophia the intelligence report that had come through their international network. How many children involved? Sophia asked. Preliminary estimates suggest over 300, spread across 15 facilities. Sophia felt the familiar surge of anger and determination that had driven her for the past 8 years. Somewhere in the world, children were being tortured in the name of medical research, and their voices were being silenced by adults who profited from their suffering. Then we'd better get to work, Sophia said simply. As the Sterling Foundation team prepared for their next international operation, Sophia reflected on how far she had come from the broken child who had been rescued from Mountain View's basement. The systematic abuse that Victoria had inflicted was supposed to destroy her mind and steal her voice forever. Instead, it had forged her into something that corrupt institutions around the world had learned to fear: a survivor who refused to stay silent, an advocate who couldn't be bought or threatened, and a voice for children who had been written off as hopeless cases. The little girl who had been kicked out by her stepmother after her father's funeral had become exactly what Victoria Sterling had tried to prevent: a witness whose testimony could not be discredited, a fighter whose determination could not be broken, and a force for justice that would continue growing long after Victoria's crimes had been forgotten. In institutions around the world, children who had given up hope were about to discover that rescue was coming. And in boardrooms where profits mattered more than children's lives, corrupt officials were about to learn what Victoria Sterling had learned too late. Sometimes the most broken people become the strongest healers. Sometimes the most silenced voices become the most powerful advocates. And sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places, like a foundation built from the ashes of one family's destruction and dedicated to ensuring that no child would ever again face the darkness alone. The war against institutional child abuse would continue, but it would be fought by survivors who had learned that healing was not about forgetting. It was about using pain to fuel purpose, trauma to create strength, and survival to inspire service. Sophia Sterling closed her journal and prepared for another day of fighting for children who couldn't fight for themselves. The 8-year-old who had clutched her father's photograph in a psychiatric institution had grown up to become something Victoria Sterling never could have imagined. Not a victim, but a victor. Not a casualty, but a champion. Not a broken child, but a warrior for justice whose legacy would protect generations of children yet to come. If Sophia's courage inspired you, show it by hitting that like button, because stories like this need to be heard. Drop a comment below telling us what shocked you most. And don't forget to share this with someone who believes in fighting for justice. And if you want to hear more true stories of survival and triumph over evil, subscribe and ring that notification bell. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon against darkness is simply refusing to let these stories be forgotten.